Good morning, or afternoon, or the evening, as the case may be. I'm Michael Cott. I'm the director of FHI Civil Society and Peacebuilding Department and a technical advisor on this project. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event, presenting this year's Organizational Sustainability Index. I wanted to thank you all for coming. It looks like we have over 200 people participating. I wanted to particularly thank the 74 organizations all over the world who have contributed to this report. And also I wanted to thank our panelists representing ICNL, US Peace Institute, Hungarian Environmental Partnership, Maharat Foundation. And I also wanted to thank the team that's worked on this. So first of all, our AOR, Tina Del Castillo, and the FHI team, Eka Emishvili, William Daly, Alex Nahajian, Alexis Leary. Falls to me to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Tessie San Martin, who's recently become our COO. She has worked as the president of Plan International previously, and before that, she worked for ACT Associates as its vice president. She holds a doctorate from Harvard in political economy and government, and a master's from the John F. Kennedy School of Government. I also just wanted to direct you, the biographies of Tessie's biography, as well as those of the panelists. I think you have been provided, so you can look at those. So without further ado, I would like to invite Tessie to the virtual podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and hello to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, from wherever, whatever it is for you today. It's terrific to be part of this event, this virtual launch of USAID's 2020 Civil Society Organization Sustainability Index. And it's been great to see the growth of the work of this index over the years, right? Starting from 18 countries, almost a quarter of a century ago, in 18 countries in Central, Eastern Europe and Eurasia, and expanding today to 73 countries in virtually every part of the world. And by the way, this is FHI 360's fourth year supporting the index and the launch, and it truly is our privilege to be part of this very important effort. And why is this effort important? Well, just allow me. I'm sure everybody that's here understands it, but here's how I see it, right? In her November 4th speech at Georgetown, Administrator Samantha Power challenged all of us in the development community. She stated that we must offer people not a vision of merely international development, but inclusive development. And she defined inclusive development as aid that is more focused on the voices and the needs of the most marginalized, and aid that is most responsive. The administrator's vision of locally led development emphasizes that these local voices must be at the center of the work we do. And a strong civil society is essential to delivering on that vision. There can be no locally led development without strong civil society institutions. Moreover, look, we live in a world where corruption, impunity, growing inequality, violence are just all too often in too many countries eroding citizens' faith in their government and really sort of eroding democratic institutions. Civil societies are essential to strengthening that fabric of social accountability. In fact, again, Administrator Power and Treasury Secretary Yellen said as much in a recent op-ed piece in the Washington Post, noting, right, that civil society and a free press are key to addressing corruption, and that the corruption that is weakening democratic institutions here and abroad. So civil society is essential to the health of democracies. The health of civil society is essential to the health of democracies. So this all speaks to me about the essential nature of this index. The work that is done across the globe to put these reports together brings attention to the health of the sector and the sustainability of the sector. And I hope that you all will find this year's reports insightful and useful in your own work. By the way, speaking of locally led development, right, the index is one of the few global publications of its kind where local implementing partners lead the process and write the reports. Some of our implementing partners have been working on this for over 10 years. We are very happy that so many are joining us here today. And by the way, so this event is virtual this year. It was virtual last year. It usually was an in-person event. But I have to say that the virtual nature of the event speaks to, and honestly, I think accentuates the inclusive nature of this effort and makes it possible, right, for my organization, FHI 360, USAID Center for Democracy, Human Rights and Governance, and the International Center for Nonprofit Law, all of whom are, of course, engaged in this, in supporting this process. It allows us to welcome participants from far and wide across time zones and continents, and we're very grateful to have all of you join us today. So 2020 was no doubt a challenging year, one that, of course, in addition to the political, economic, security, climate-related factors that buffeted all of us, a lot of them, of course, brought by COVID, which itself introduced additional, complications, made the operational environment for civil society organizations extremely difficult. On top of that, of course, we've got the, it seems at times inexorable advance of efforts to close the space for civil society in too many countries. Yet, as we saw in the reports, civil society has proven itself to be enormously resilient, has found ways to continue to collaborate and continue to deliver for the communities, for the populations that they support. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion today, as our panelists really unpack what CSOs and civic actors in any number of operational environments are seeing as opportunities and challenges. So I'll just close here and again, thank everyone. These events don't come together by accident. It takes a village. And this has been a real effort across all kinds of organizations, not just us, but the International Center for Nonprofit Law, USAID, and so many of the organizations, of course, that are here with us today. Thank you again for all your efforts and for participating here today. So now it is my privilege to introduce today's keynote speaker, who's Deputy Assistant Administrator Johnny Walsh. Deputy Assistant Administrator Walsh oversees the Center for Democracy, Human Rights and Governance. Before he took this position, he was a senior expert at the United States Institute of Peace and has also served our government in a range of important foreign policy roles, including the U.S. mission to the United Nations as a senior policy advisor for the Middle East and South Asia, several states in the State Department as lead advisor on Afghanistan's peace process, and tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I could go on, but I think I'm just going to ask everyone to please join me in welcoming Deputy Assistant Administrator Walsh to the virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Tessie. It's such an honor to be here. That's a very kind introduction, and thank you for the thoughtful reflections on the moment that we find ourselves in. And I think a little bit of positive feedback on some of the things that we've tried to do under administrator power so far. I hope we can live up to that. You'll pardon us for all kind of congratulating each other, praising each other on this accomplishment of the new CSO-SI index. But I just have to thank FHI 360, our amazing partner, and the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, ICNL, which has, both of which are just amazing. And I'd single out ICNL for giving us such guidance over a huge range of things in addition to this in my early months in this job. They've definitely prevented me and us from falling astray many times. I would thank our local partners, so many of them are executive committee members. And also, you know, I speak for the Democracy, Rights, and Governance Center at USAID, but we're so grateful to all the other parts of the enormous apparatus that is USAID for helping make CSO-SI a success year after year. I mean, there's such support, buy-in to this concept from the regional bureaus, the missions around the world, and we are just endlessly grateful. So I'm, like I say, I'm honored to join this group just with these distinguished panelists, some friends and people I've admired a long time that you'll hear from later on, who have a wealth of expertise, certainly dwarfing my own on the most challenging problems that civil society faces, but also like a deep, I think these folks have deeply internalized how resilient civil society can be. It's not the first time that it's been hard in the world to be a civil society activist. And I hope that we can hear some lessons about how to navigate the perils of this moment. So as has been mentioned, this is the 24th year that we've tracked the trends that are most important to the health of civil society through this index. Tons has changed over the last 2 decades, but civil society is as important as it's ever been. I would single out what Tessie said about administrator power, both in the Georgetown speech and in that op-ed with Secretary Yellen. I mean, those remarks in each format were really from the heart for her. And I go back a little way with her in government service, and like her belief that credible, noble civil society work is so crucial to the survival of democracy, of our respect for human rights. And even there's a million ways you could depict that in her case, but I would single out, it's so common when she or we arrive in a country, she will seek to meet with local activists or other forms of civil society first, even before she goes in to see the president or the prime minister or wherever we are. And she's going in quest of a truth bomb to like understand things about the local, just the local scene, whatever the problem is in a given country, that like we, the staff, can't really give her, at least can't give her directly. And that she can take in to raise with the senior most leadership of a country. And that's one way that I think she sees the value of an office like hers. So we were continually looking for ways to elevate our civil society friends and partners in more or less literally every context that we work in. 2020, very unusual year, very difficult year, as Tessie said, in addition to the ongoing scourge of democratic backsliding, which we see in every continent and region that we study in this project, and countries at every level of development. Now we had COVID, which in addition to everything else that it was probably the worst bane to civic space that we could attribute to a single cause globally that we've seen in, I don't know, a very long time. So that played out in Asia, Africa, Middle East, as governments ostensibly tried to curb the spread of the virus, but actually used whatever the tool was to silence its critics. I think in the Middle East, we saw severe limits on civil liberties in 6 of the 8 countries studied. Europe, Eurasia, I haven't even mentioned, but this was a chronic problem, and like it's the work of years to come to look at how the reasonable restrictions can be decoupled from the unreasonable or cynical ones, to roll back where appropriate or where public health permits the kinds of restrictions that were put in place. But 2020 was tough. I would just say though that like 2021 was also an unusual year, and 2022 is going to be a crucial year. And in 2021, not that it's all about any given administration or any given country, including ours, but we did have our reality included that we had the arrival of a president who talks about the importance of defending and advancing democracy every time he talks about foreign policy, often the very first thing out of his mouth, centermost thought in Biden's mind, I think. We just saw that manifested, hopefully successfully, in the Summit for Democracy last week. And you saw what an emphasis that signature event of this administration put on civic space. It was one of the handful of dedicated in-depth panels where we highlighted some heroes of the protection of civic space around the world. And for our part at USAID, I mean, the main way that we viewed the summit was less, how can we achieve the perfect event? And more like, what can we use this event to get done? And so you saw the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal. We spent the whole year working on the USAID part of it. Our state counterparts did likewise. I think it's the most significant single contribution the USG has made to defending, advancing democracy around the world in a very long time, maybe a generation. But I would, and so not all of the programs within it are directly about civil society, though there is a touch point in probably almost all of them. I would single out some things that we're unveiling in that initiative, though, like the Powered by the People initiative, which is essentially a way to try and connect peaceful movements with each other around the world so they can learn from each other, build each other up. It can also connect them with outside expertise. I won't go into all the details of the exact program, though that's what I love talking about. I would just say it's a sign of how we're trying to take an evergreen cause like supporting civil society everywhere, which is so central to our mission at DRG, at USAID generally, and to update it for the challenges of the backsliding era, the 21st century, all the problems we face now that weren't true when the field of democracy promotion maybe came into being in the 90s and where a lot of our core precepts came from. And now, I think that 2022 is even more important because we need to be measured on the effectiveness of what we've put in place. And so there needs to be humility in that, in the sense that like no one country, certainly no one wonkish policy initiative is going to reverse these tectonic trends like democratic backsliding around the world. But I do hope that the event, the substance surrounding the event, the amount of attention, the amount of enthusiasm we got from other democracies, from civil society, from foundations around the world, from democratic actors in very undemocratic countries, which we tried to highlight at the event. I hope that bringing that all together starts to put a dent in this problem. And if it does, it's tools like CSOSI that maybe slightly downstream we're going to use to try and hold ourselves to account and like take a hard look at in what ways is the environment changing. And like, I'm not trying to confuse correlation with causality here, and I'm certainly not saying anything good that happens as a result of what we've just unveiled. But I think that there are positive changes underway. In some ways, the very direness of the backsliding problem, of the closure of civic space around the world, of the abuses that have been perpetrated against civil society, have sort of constructively freaked us all out and given us reason to raise these issues way up higher in the priority list than they maybe were as we luxuriated in past decades where maybe we could afford to think about other things, or at least we thought we could. So I'm so grateful to have like intellectually rigorous, time-tested, partner-driven tools like CSOSI that can sort of glue us all together in this larger enterprise. So I'll shut up now. You should hear from the real experts, but I just want to recognize the enormous amount of hard work from all those who collaborated to put this together this year and in past years. Well done to all of you. And thank you again to FHI 360 for hosting us, and to ICNL and all our partners for just the work that you do. So thank you so much.
And thank you to both Dr. San Martin and DA Walsh for doing such a good job of setting the stage and providing such a comprehensive overview of the context in which the 2020 CSO-SI was published. I'm Jennifer Stewart. I'm the editor and project manager for the index at ICNL. I'm glad to be here today. I'm going to briefly provide an overview of the methodology for those of you who are not as familiar with the index, but mostly focus on some of the most interesting results from the 2020 process. We could go to the next slide. Without the music. So the index is intended to be a useful source of information for local CSOs, governments, donors, academics, and others who want to better understand and monitor key aspects of sustainability in the CSO sector. And the way it does this is by assessing the strength and overall viability of CSO sectors around the world by analyzing 7 key components or dimensions that are critical to the sustainability of civil society sectors, which are shown here. Next slide. As Dr. San Martin mentioned, the index centers, the methodology centers local ownership and empowerment. It's really meant to provide an opportunity for local CSOs and civil society actors to step away from their day-to-day work and look at the overall environments in which they operate to identify both their strengths and weaknesses and priorities moving forward. The country reports are developed through a collaborative process, beginning with a local partner that organizes an expert panel consisting of CSO practitioners and experts. The panel assesses and rates the 7 dimensions of CSO sustainability during the year and discusses what's been going on. And this serves as the basis of a report that the local partner drafts, which is then reviewed and approved by an editorial committee to maintain high standards and consistency. Next slide. So the index utilizes a 7-point scoring scale in which a 1 indicates the most robust level of sustainability and 7 indicates the lowest level. The dimension scores are averaged to produce an overall sustainability score for the CSO sector in a given country. And the scores are organized into 3 basic categories, representing the level of development of the sector. So sustainability enhanced is the highest level of sustainability. It includes scores from 1 to 3. Sustainability impeded is the lowest level of sustainability, including scores between 5 and 7, and in between is sustainability evolving, covering scores between 3 and 5. Next slide. So as other speakers have mentioned, the various editions of the 2020 index covered 73 countries. This means that there are nearly 600 individual scores and over 1,000 pages of text in our narrative reports. Obviously, I can't cover all of this data, but I will try to highlight some of the key findings over the next few minutes. This map, which is taken from our CSO SI dashboard, shows the stage of overall CSO sustainability for all 73 countries during what has been mentioned was obviously some unprecedented circumstances in 2020. As you can see, the majority of countries still have scores that fall into sustainability evolving, that middle category of sustainability, which are shown here in the varying stages, varying shades of yellow. There are only 7 countries, all of which are in Europe, that have overall scores in the highest category of sustainability, sustainability enhanced, while there are 16 countries in the lowest category, sustainability impeded, which are shown in orange and red. This includes 9 in Africa, 4 in the Middle East and North Africa, 2 in Europe and Eurasia, and 1 in Asia. And so that really highlights the work that remains to be done. In a significant negative development, the overall scores of 3 countries, Cameroon, Thailand, and Jordan, fell from sustainability evolving to sustainability impeded in 2020. Next slide. This map looks at overall CSO sustainability from another perspective, showing how the situation in 2020 compared to that in 2019. So here, green indicates that overall CSO sustainability improved in 2020, red indicates that it deteriorated, and yellow indicates that it did not change. As you can see, despite the challenging circumstances in 2020, overall CSO sustainability remained stable in a large number of countries. 45 countries reported no change in their overall CSO sustainability scores. And it actually improved in 9 countries, including 5 in Africa, 2 in Europe and Eurasia, and 2 in the Middle East and North Africa. At the same time, however, we saw overall sustainability deteriorate in 19 countries, including 5 in Asia, 8 in Africa, 3 in Europe and Eurasia, 2 in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as Mexico. And while this may not be quite as bad as some of us anticipated at the beginning of 2021, it was a significant difference from the previous year when twice as many countries had improved scores and about 30% fewer countries had worse scores. Next slide. So next, I want to take a look at the dimensions of sustainability. This chart shows the average scores for each dimension across all 73 countries in this year's index. As you can see, there's not a huge amount of variation between the overall averages. But as in previous years, advocacy continues to be the strongest dimension, while financial viability is the weakest dimension and the only one with an average score that falls in sustainability impeded. Next. This chart is a bit complicated, but is meant to show how the dimension scores changed between 2019 and 2020 on a regional basis. So on this chart, the colored bars that are above the center line indicate the number of countries that had improved scores in each dimension in 2020, and the bars below the center line indicate the number of countries where scores deteriorated. Each region is indicated by a different color, so blue is Europe and Eurasia, green is Africa, yellow is Asia, red is the Middle East and North Africa, and orange is Mexico. And I just want to highlight that the number of countries in each region varies dramatically. So while there are 32 countries in Africa and 24 in Europe and Eurasia, there's only 8 in the Middle East and North Africa and Asia, and Mexico stands alone. So the potential size of those bars is quite different. As you can see, there's quite a bit of variation in what happened in each dimension and in each region. Some of which highlight weaknesses in the sector revealed by the pandemic, and others that confirm CSO's ability to withstand extreme stress. And I'm going to spend the rest of my time unpacking some of these key differences. Next slide. So I'm going to start out with the bad news. Previous speakers talked a lot about the democratic backsliding that's happening around the world, which we all know well about, and this was really reflected in the legal environment dimension of the index. Over half of the countries, 36 in total, nearly half of the countries, 36 in total, experienced deterioration in their legal environment scores this year. This was less of an issue in Europe and Eurasia, where just a quarter of the countries reported these kinds of problems, than it was in sub-Saharan Africa, where it was half of the countries, and Asia and the Middle East, where it was 3/4 of the countries that are covered. A large number of the declines were driven by restrictions imposed in response to the COVID crisis, including measures that constrain the freedoms of assembly, association, and expression. In some cases, national governments used the health precautions around COVID-19 as well as other measures to further repress and silence government critics. And this is something that will be discussed a little bit more in the panel. To highlight a few significant examples of these negative trends, I wanted to point out that Thailand and the Philippines reported the most drastic deteriorations, a 0.4, which is considered quite significant by the index's methodology. This was actually the biggest change in scores in any of the dimensions. So in Thailand, for example, the government used the COVID-19 emergency decree to crack down on and impose drastic control over dissenting voices, both online and offline. It's also worth noting that in 2020, the legal environment score for South Sudan fell to 7.0, the absolute rock bottom of our scoring scale. There are circumstances surrounding the pandemic made it more difficult for CSOs to register and receive approvals for activities, while the government severely impeded CSOs' work and arbitrarily arrested and detained CSO activists. And finally, in Europe and Eurasia, it's worth mentioning the situation in Belarus, where, of course, a controversial election was followed by protests that the authorities responded to with mass repression. State harassment of CSOs and activists was a major problem, and new regulations limited CSOs' access to foreign funding and required CSOs to publish additional reports on their income and expenses. And as a result of these developments, the legal environment score in Belarus fell to 6.9. Next slide. As I mentioned previously, financial viability has long been the weakest dimension in the index. And unfortunately, financial viability took another big hit in 2020, with more than half of the countries surveyed, including a significant number in each region, registering declines in this dimension. The root cause of the declines here was also largely related to COVID. Foreign donor funding, of course, continues to be an important source of funding for CSO sectors across the globe. And in 2020, many reports noted that their foreign partners suspended or rerouted funding. This particularly affected the financial viability of organizations that weren't able to shift their work to COVID-related activities. In some countries, foreign funding related to the pandemic benefited governments, which did not always include CSOs in their efforts. We also saw declines in funding from national governments as they too shifted resources to address the pandemic, and business support, which had started to grow in recent years, declined as businesses' income was impacted by shutdowns and the global economic downturn. One bright spot in financial viability was the fact that there was a surge in individual philanthropy in many countries, especially during the first wave of the pandemic. So in Romania, for example, an organization whose name I will probably butcher, Dăruiește Viața Association, raised €4 million in just 6 weeks from over 250,000 individuals and 600 companies to support medical units and build a new modular hospital. CSOs were also successful in raising funds for other local priorities. So in Lebanon, for example, CSOs received a lot of funding, including through crowdfunding efforts targeting the diaspora after the Beirut blast. Next slide. In other dimensions, the news was more mixed. While not always reflected in the scores for this dimension, CSOs across the 73 countries covered by this edition of the index made great strides in service provision, responding ably to local communities' needs, particularly those related to the pandemic. As a result of these efforts, 20 countries recorded improvements. And in nearly all countries, whether or not their service provision scores actually improved, we saw CSOs playing a key role, both in the distribution of humanitarian aid, food support, and PPE, and in raising awareness about the virus and measures to mitigate its spread. The improvements were particularly pronounced in the Middle East and North Africa, where 6 of 8 countries covered had better scores thanks to their efforts to respond to the pandemic, as well as other crises in the region, such as the explosion in Beirut and the ongoing conflict in Libya. In other cases, though, restrictions related to the pandemic, as well as decreases in or the redirection of funding, resulted in decreases in service provision. And this trend was particularly notable in Asia, where dwindling resources, travel restrictions, and limitations on in-person gatherings constrained CSO's ability to operate and provide either traditional services or emergency relief in 2020. Next slide. In advocacy, we also saw mixed trends. We had similar numbers of countries reporting improvements and deteriorations, but there is some cause for optimism. I wanted to point out that of the 20 countries that reported improvements in their advocacy, 18 of these were in Africa. We saw CSOs in many African countries advocating vigorously on pandemic-related topics, especially the need for inclusivity and accountability regarding the use of funds, and also performing critical watchdog roles in monitoring governments' handling of pandemic funds. In contrast, advocacy declined notably in Asia, with 5 of the 8 countries recording deteriorations. Here, pandemic-related restrictions obstructed CSO advocacy efforts by limiting access to policymakers and other stakeholders, while other measures increased self-censorship, especially online, leaving CSOs with few safe platforms to promote their issues or raise concerns about government regulations and responses to the health crisis. Next slide. Finally, on a more positive note, we saw, again, nearly half of the countries report improvements in their public image, including half of the countries in Africa and Europe and Eurasia, and more than half of those in the Middle East. This reflects increased public recognition and media coverage of the role CSOs played during the COVID crisis, as well as other key events and priorities during the year. And the Philippines is an interesting example here. Public image improved moderately in the Philippines, despite the fact that every other dimension reported declines. And this is really thanks to the public recognition of CSO's relief work at the local level. Next slide. And finally, I don't have time to go into depth to the other 2 dimensions, organizational capacity and sectoral infrastructure, but I did just want to note that there were some positive developments in these dimensions as well. First, the increased use of technologies, such as using Zoom for these kinds of events, led to some improvements in organizational capacity, as well as the availability of training, which is captured in the infrastructure dimension. We also saw CSOs develop closer ties with their constituents and with each other. And I wanted to note Mexico here. In Mexico, the sectoral infrastructure was the only dimension reporting an improvement, where the sector increasingly formed networks and coalitions to overcome the challenges presented by the pandemic and dwindling funds, while CSO support services continue to expand. And next slide. And again, I was only able to scratch the surface of all of the interesting trends and examples covered in this edition of the index. For those of you who are interested in delving deeper into the data or accessing reports from this year or previous years, I encourage you to visit our CSOSI dashboard at csosi.org. This is an interactive site. It includes historical data and reports for the index, allows you to manipulate, play around with the data to see correlations in various ways. And with that, thank you for your time. Happy to answer any questions later, but I will pass it on to Lisa Peterson, who's going to moderate our panel discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for always presenting such clear and thoughtful summaries of the CSOSI findings, as well as the methodology used. And warm greetings to everyone in attendance today, this afternoon, this evening. My name is Lisa Peterson, and I am a technical director at FHI 360. We'll now move into a panel discussion, as Jennifer said, with two overarching themes. The first is changing civic space and activism, and the second is opportunities for CSOs to forge a new path. And before we begin the panel, I would like to introduce our panelists for today. First, I am very happy to introduce Ms. Catherine Shea, who is Vice President of Programs at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, or ICNL. Kathy is a lawyer and a public policy expert, and she specializes in the development of enabling legal environments for civil society and citizen participation. She has provided this type of support in 27 countries worldwide. Her areas of expertise at ICNL include regulatory and accountability issues facing civil society, including tax, internal governance, accountability and transparency, and self-regulation. She has authored several publications at ICNL, including its Central and Eastern European regional tax survey. Kathy is a former Assistant Chief Litigation Counsel for the U.S. Security and Exchange Commission's Division of Enforcement, where she litigated cases involving complex issues of security fraud. Welcome, Kathy. Nice to see you. And next, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to a friend and former colleague, Dr. Joseph Sani, who is currently Vice President of the Africa Center at the U.S. Institute for Peace, USIP. For over 20 years, Dr. Sani has worked at the forefront of peace-building efforts with CSOs, governments, businesses, and international organizations, particularly those based in Africa. Prior to joining USIP, Dr. Sani worked with us at FHI 360 in the Civil Society and Peacebuilding Department, where he provided technical leadership in the design and implementation of several peacebuilding and civil society strengthening programs. He also advised the design, implementation, and dissemination of the CSOSI reports. And he reminded me this week that this is his 10th year of involvement with CSOSI, so a full decade. Dr. Sani has published several articles on peace building, peacekeeping, and civil society, and he authored a book entitled Reintegration of Ex-Combatants, a Balancing Act. Welcome, Dr. Sani. Third, I would like to welcome and introduce Ms. Vera Mora, who is the director of the Hungarian Environmental Partnership Foundation, HEPF. This is a position she has held since 2007. Since 2003, Vera has led the foundation's Civil Partners Program, which helps to improve the legal fiscal environment for the civil society sector. She also has experience in managing various grants programs, including the Hungarian NGO Fund. In addition to her full-time position with HEPF, Vera serves in multiple volunteer positions with NGOs and holds the position of chair of the Hungarian Donors Forum. A warm welcome to you, Vera. And finally, I would like to welcome Ms. Layal Banam, Program Manager at the Maharat Foundation in Lebanon. Layal has extensive experience in media development, community engagement, freedom of expression, internet freedom, and human rights. She's known for forging solutions to the many challenges faced by citizens in the Middle East and North Africa. Layal has over 10 years of experience in designing programs and leading project teams while mitigating the many potential risks inherent in working in her region. She has a background in public law, broad expertise in the media sector, and currently serves as a board member for the International Freedom of Expression Exchange, IFEX. Welcome, Layal. Nice to have you with us today. As we move ahead with the questions, just a friendly reminder to the panelists that in the interest of keeping time, we would greatly appreciate your limiting your responses to 3 minutes or less. Thank you in advance. And now, on the theme of changing civic space and activism, I'd like to direct the first question to Kathy Shea of ICNL. Kathy, in 2020, we saw civic space continue to shrink. Simultaneously, a lot of donor funding was repurposed to support pandemic response work. Yet civil society was no less vibrant, organizing a number of large protests against democratic backsliding, mobilizing on behalf of vulnerable and marginalized communities affected by the pandemic, and promoting communities' resilience. What trends has ICNL identified over the past 2 years with regard to shrinking civic space?
Thank you, Lisa. I'm really excited to see another edition of the CSOSIs published. As always, it's a wonderful resource with abundant information about the health of civil society. I'll note 3 trends with respect to shrinking civic space that we at ICNL have observed and that are reflected in the index as well. ICNL maintains a COVID-19 Civic Freedom Tracker, which you can find on our website, and it has documented since March 2020 hundreds of laws, orders, and emergency measures that restrict fundamental rights such as association, assembly, expression, and privacy that have been imposed in response to the pandemic. These include at least 58 countries in which governments impose restrictions on the right to expression, and I'll focus on just one aspect of that, new laws and policies that clamp down on misinformation related to the pandemic. For example, Madagascar allowed only official information about the pandemic to be reported and banned public call-in radio shows. In Cambodia, emergency laws granted the government the power to surveil and restrict the media. And more than 40 people were arrested for spreading pandemic-related fake news. In Jordan, Defense Order Number 8 made it illegal to report on anything related to the pandemic that would quote unquote cause panic, effectively making the government the only legal source of information. So we saw a number of restrictions surrounding expression during the pandemic. In a related development, even as much as the world turned to online work in response to the pandemic, countries introduced new restrictive laws on digital communications. Nigeria famously banned Twitter. In Niger, a new law allowed the government to monitor communications in the interest of national security. And Zambia and Uganda introduced laws restricting social media use. The Digital Security Law Act in Bangladesh was deployed to crack down on rumors and misinformation about the pandemic, and 457 people were arrested in 2020 using this law. Finally, thirdly, we saw restrictions on civil society surrounding elections. It's already been mentioned that Belarus's fraudulent election in August led to the largest demonstration since 1990, and 33,000 people, including civil society activists, were detained during the ensuing crackdown. During Guinea's election cycle, authorities used COVID-19 as a justification for limiting rallies and public gatherings, though assemblies in support of those in power were often still allowed to take place. In Uganda's 2021 presidential election, the leader of an opposition party was arrested for violating COVID-19 restrictions when his rallies attracted large crowds. and the use of security forces at large events was selectively applied, leading to violence at opposition events that killed dozens. So a number of negative trends continue with regard to shrinking civic space. You're right, though, to point out how vibrant civil society remained. Despite the unfavorable operating environment in many countries, civil society groups were often heroes during the pandemic, standing up for human rights, advocating for their constituents, and providing humanitarian aid and other necessary services.
Thank you, Kathy. And you started to touch on this at the end of your response, but what do you see as the new forms of civic activism that have emerged in response to and despite shrinking civic space?
Sure. First, I'd like to focus on advocacy. I mean, CSOs continue to advocate for their causes with success, oftentimes now focusing on pandemic-related issues. So, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, we saw advocacy scores improve in more than half the countries covered by the index, as CSOs focus on holding their governments accountable during the pandemic and ensuring, for example, proper use of emergency funds. Organizations in Ethiopia, Liberia, Nigeria, South Africa, and South Sudan push for a more gender-inclusive type of response to the pandemic. Second, it's also already been mentioned too, but service provision was a real highlight. CSOs stepped up with regard to service provision in response to the pandemic. They continued to provide essential services and oftentimes improve their public image as a result. For example, in the MENA region, we saw 6 out of 8 countries having improved service provision scores. And so in addition to providing pandemic-related services such as distribution of aid and awareness raising, CSOs responded to crises. In response to the explosion in Lebanon in August 2020, CSOs leapt into action, providing support such as cleaning debris and distributing food, renovation work, and psychosocial assistance. While in Libya, CSOs continued to provide humanitarian relief to victims of the ongoing conflict. Finally, we saw innovations in activism. CSOs often had to find new ways to organize to deal with pandemic-related restrictions. And like those of us here, they moved online. In some countries, this helped them increase their effectiveness. So for example, the Albania report notes that CSOs and others could more easily access parliamentary committee meetings now that they're held online. And this fostered greater transparency in legislative proceedings. In Mozambique, CSOs noted that online meetings were easier to organize than in-person meetings, and they were able, therefore, to improve sectoral coordination. In Zimbabwe, CSOs created virtual talk shows and business conferences. Creativity wasn't limited to online space, though. And an interesting example from Slovenia, we saw protesters organizing a bicycle protest where they rode through the streets in order to avoid pandemic-related restrictions on gatherings. So those are just a few examples of civic activism during the last year.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I'd like to direct my next question to Dr. Sani. Dr. Sani, another development in the sector noted by a number of pundits and publications over the past 2 years relates to both traditional CSOs and emerging actors, proving themselves capable of providing more inclusive services and strengthening and diversifying their networking and collaboration efforts. How do you feel the pandemic has affected the cause of localizing development and the long discussed desire to make international aid more inclusive?
Thank you, Lisa. It's good to be here. Before I respond, I would like to thank FHI and ICNL for hosting this event, and also thank USAID for supporting this program for such a long time. I think the CSOSI index is a reference, and particularly at this time of democratic backsliding. So kudos to USAID and kudos to FHI for organizing and coordinating the effort of 74 implementing partners in the globe. This is a massive undertaking. I don't want us to forget that. And again, kudos to FHI 360 and ICNL. So in response to your question, I will say definitively yes. I think COVID-19 has enabled local civil society to reaffirm the importance and therefore advance and make progress in the localization agenda. Because given the travel requirement and the logistic challenges of moving around, international partners and donors came to rely and recognize, very important, not just rely because we used to rely, we know that, but recognize the value add of local partners. And recognize that local partners not only can bring value, but as Kathy mentioned, are creative, possess local knowledge and connections that are necessary to advance development agenda. And so one particular dimension in the localization agenda that really caught my eye is the notion of local ownership. The local ownership, the way I look at it, has three components: commitment, capacity, and contribution. Around those three components, we have seen local civil society make progress, demonstrating their commitment to the issues they are driving, and also demonstrating that they have the capacity to engage in those issues. Of course, there's still a need of improvement in terms of beefing those capacities, but particularly around resources, not around sometimes expertise. And also contribution. We have clearly, as Kathy mentioned, I'm sure my colleagues, my co-panelists will mention, that the contribution was clearly, there were major achievement in terms of local civil society contribution in the development agenda. In our work, for example, at USIP in the Africa Center, we have just one example in South Sudan, because South Sudan was mentioned. We are working with the New Tribe, a non-violent organization that incorporates the 64 tribes of South Sudan. And so when COVID hit, this youth organization really shifted, pivoted to not only online services, but also engaging in dialogues so that young people will be involved in COVID response policies. And they were very successful at mobilizing young people and the government working hand by hand through the Give Youth a Chance platform and the Youth Social Campaign for that. So in a nutshell, really, I will say COVID-19 allow us and international community and donors to see the value add, the creativity of civil society organization, but also to redefine relationships of power. Because now civil society, particularly in non-Western countries, have come to realize their power in implementing the development agenda. And that will be critical moving forward. That redefinition of power will be critical if we want to advance localization. I will stop there for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunny. I actually have a follow-up still on the topic of inclusion. Based on your work at USIP, how do you think successful inclusive peace-building best practices could be applied to international aid?
Fascinating question, because we are working again, trying to identify what it looks like, frankly. It happened that USIP also has the diversity, equity, inclusion agenda that we are trying to move forward. How do we make the field of peace building more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive? And so your question is spot on. I think from the initial work we have is to recognize that there are some barriers to inclusion. We have to recognize we are not ignore them. So language, gender, geography, and some other intersecting identities. And so first is to recognize and accept them. And I think one thing that came clearly through COVID, sometimes some crises can spark creativity, video conferencing. Mm-hmm. You know, now all of us have a small square box on a dark screen. That's COVID and video conferencing came as equalizer. So I think we should embrace that, recognizing that we have now the technology that can enable us to be more inclusive across geography, right? So that's something we have learned and we want to harness. The other thing is that how do we frame exclusion? How do we frame the DEI agenda? And it's to engage in a conversation where people are allowed to frame what inclusion means in their own terms. not to colonize that language. I think sometimes we tend, particularly Western countries or what we call the global North, to identify this kind of issue and frame them in our own terms and generalize that framing. For example, decolonizing foreign aid, for example. We are generalizing a framing that may not necessarily resonate with non-Western countries. So it's important to create the space to allow people to frame what inclusion means for them. But at the end of the day, what we want to do is to make sure that different perspectives are recognized, are validated. Now, we are still working on the mechanics to do that. But that, I think that's at the end of the day what it means, not allowing people, we are not the gatekeeper of the table, but making sure that the space is safe enough for multiple perspectives to be recognized and heard.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Sani. Now I'd like to switch gears and ask a few questions related to the second cross-cutting theme of the panel, which is opportunities to forge a new path. And I would like to direct the next question to Vera Mora. Vera, Hungary is one of the many countries where the public image of the civil society sector is polarized and where disinformation has affected some people's views. What types of strategic communication strategies might civil society apply in the current context to counter the polarizing narrative about the sector, but in ways that bring people together and don't simply exaggerate existing fault lines?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the very flattering invitation to speak at this event. And it's quite interesting that you're asking this from me because according to a very recent research result, in spite of the democratic backsliding we observed in Hungary for like a decade, the public image of civil society is not as negative and as polarized as we could imagine. And this also chimes in with the overall results. Well, Jennifer has shown that the public image of civil society has increased in 2020 compared to the year before in many countries. And in Hungary, we've seen that according to this new research, that about 1/3 of the people, the respondents, have helped a civil society organization in one way or the other over the past year. And also quite significant number of people, like 16% of the respondents themselves or their families and friends received support from a civil society organization. So there is a mutual relationship between citizens and civil society organizations, which has not deteriorated in a way that we might imagine that. And I think this is something that civil society organizations can and must build upon. They should speak with a unified voice in the sense that they should show and talk about how civil society in general and how the individual organizations work for the public good and for people's well-being and for the good of all. So not so much talk about what divides us, but rather to talk about what unites us. Even in these polarized societies. And for example, some of the organizations that have been smeared and vilified by governmental communication campaigns have been able to, again, in response to the pandemic, do some very, very important work in explaining the government's measures and restrictions to the general public to help people understand the rules and the regulations, which gave them another type of credibility, while at the same time also being a human rights organization and rights defender. So I think civil society should resist against divisions by governmental agents or external institutions, and speak in one voice and show its benefit for the public good and for the individual people through stories and positive imaging. That would be my short answer to this.
Thank you so much, Vera. And I see you're already getting requests for the research that you cited in the chat, which is wonderful. Lyle, I would like to direct the next question to you. The COVID-19 era has necessitated a digitalization of local development work. Many CSOs have taken advantage of this transition to improve their technological know-how in ways that benefit their work and to find ways to connect with their constituents and each other more effectively. Based on what you've seen in Lebanon and in the region at large, how do you think CSOs can best leverage these opportunities to push for changes in the CSO landscape and in international aid worldwide?
Hello, Lisa. Hello, everyone. Thank you for hosting me. So answering your question, of course, COVID-19 was an opportunity for the civil society organizations in Lebanon and the MENA to explore more how to reach constituencies through technology. And this is actually a very big opportunity in an environment that is more and more hostile to the work of civil society organizations, where civic spaces are shrinking all over the MENA region. And we see as a trend, whenever like the trust is increasing in the work of CSOs, and whenever CSOs are more vibrant and able to mobilize very quickly, like they did in Lebanon after the Beirut blast, for example, they were faster than the government itself, than the international organizations themselves. And like because of this increased trust, we feel that the aggression from the governments increases in the same level. So because the international community is also not accepting to provide any support anymore to the government, for example, they are rather preferring to support civil society organizations. This is like leading to a more hostile environment where the internet and the use of technologies would be an opportunity for CSOs to mitigate these challenges of threats from government agencies and from governments. So, but at the same time, there are also challenges in the use of technology that are posed. Challenges related to the lack of resources, because whenever CSOs want to shift to technology, they need more resources. With the current bad infrastructure, the current problems in connectivity, the lack of equipments, laptops, etc., and the same like lack of skills within the constituencies they are targeting, especially the most vulnerable communities. We have noticed that with CSOs working with refugees, for example, where like they don't have access to the internet all the time. It was like very difficult to engage with these constituencies when they don't have connectivity, or they can't use even the platforms that are being provided. So in order for technology to become an opportunity, more work should be done on both levels. So more resources and also more empowerment for CSOs to look at the digital security aspect as well. Whenever they are dealing in these hostile environments and shifting all their work online, they have at the same time to pay attention to the digital security threats, whereas we don't see this awareness at all levels of CSOs. So of course it's an opportunity, but at the same time there are challenges that should be tackled the same way at the level of CSOs and at the level of constituencies themselves.
Thank you so much, Lyle. Digital security is definitely an issue that we've had to face under almost all of our civil society strengthening programs at FHI. It's a critical one. I'd like to turn back to Vera for a moment. Vera, could you please tell us what changes you are looking for and what you see as the biggest challenges in achieving them? What kind of support would be most crucial at this point for local CSOs?
Wow, that's a big question. One that is difficult to answer because I don't think there is one single solution. But if I had to emphasize one thing, I think building civil society and active citizenship and constituency from the bottom up, from the grassroots level, especially in rural areas, far from the urban centers, is one of the key important aspects of building a healthy civil society. So you might have good CSOs in the capitals, but you need actually people who work with the civil society organizations, who support the civil society organizations, who become active and participate in public matters. And this kind of active citizenship can only be built on the grassroots community level and working the way up from there. So I think that kind of local organizing, awareness raising among people and giving people skills and tools to stand up for themselves and to participate, including citizen education, is one of the key areas that I would emphasize.
Thank you so much, Vera. We have a few minutes left for the panel. I would like to turn back to Kathy Shea and ask a question related to the recent Democracy Summit. This discussion about the future and about opportunities for CSOs to forge a new path also begs the question about the future of democracy and of democracies more broadly. This is especially timely after the recent Democracy Summit. What role do you think CSOs and civic actors can play in holding their governments accountable to the commitments made at the summit and in supporting the summit's goals?
Well, I'm certainly hoping that civil society all around the world is going to be helping to hold governments accountable. I think one thing that's going to be important is making sure there are effective mechanisms in summit participants for public participation, things that allow citizens to transparently see what the commitments are and what's being done, and how giving civil society a clear avenue in which to have input. So I think that's important. I think civil society is we're going to draw on its considerable organizing capacity, I think, too. We're hoping that civil society groups can come together, come up with excellent advocacy campaigns and coalitions to basically speak to government and hold them accountable as well. So those are just two thoughts on sort of how we can help maintain accountability.
Thank you, Kathy. Dr. Sani, I'd like to invite you to answer the same question. Would you like me to repeat it?
Yeah, no, it's fine. I really thank you. And I think I will build on Kathy's answer, also for Veronica's answers. I think local organizing. Frankly, if we want democracy to survive, and President Biden said the renewal of democracy, I think we need to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be an engaged citizen? Democracy is so precious, yet fragile, that we cannot leave it only to the sole hands of the politicians and the government. So civil society has a role to play in educating, engaging citizens. Let me just ask a simple question. How many of us in this call or in this conference have attended the last civic association meeting or the last neighborhood meeting? I bet not many. How many people in the United States know the name of their senators or their governors? From some statistic, more than 60% of Americans themselves don't know how many judges are in the Supreme Court. So how can you hold people accountable if you don't even know them? So it is important for civil society organizations really to work to engage citizens, to equip citizens to hold their leaders accountable, but to hold themselves accountable as well. I think it is time for citizens to play their role, not just to consent, but to exercise power. And civil society organizations should take that role. They should support, educate, and skill and organize. I mean, we have a lot of homework, we have a lot of work to do, but democracy is just too precious to be left to the hands of politicians. It is our responsibility. I will stop there, but it's a fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sani, and thank you to all of our panelists for your very thoughtful reflections and responses today. We'd like to move on now to closing remarks for this event. At this time, I would like to introduce Lauren Kirby of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Lauren has served for many years in the Civil Society and Media Division at USAID's Center for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance. And she was recently promoted. She received a very well-deserved promotion to the position of Division Lead. Congratulations and welcome, Lauren. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you, Lisa. It's too kind. Thank you so much. And thank you to the entire panel and all the speakers here today for this great event. We really appreciate your insights and your perspectives on these complex issues, including many of the challenges we heard about, but also the creative and new opportunities that civil society really experienced and seized upon during the very unusual year that was 2020. I really liked how Dr. Sani put it, crises can spark creativity. I think we've all seen this happen in our own lives, but hearing about it today for civil society, whether through the use of technology or even the use of bikes, it demonstrates not only their creativity, but also their adaptability and really, to me, their will to survive in the changing environment. So thank you again to everyone. We're really grateful for your time today and your leadership. And as Dr. San Martin emphasized earlier, your voices and other local voices throughout the CSOSI process. On that note of localization, I'd like to just put a quick plug in to note that USAID is developing our first ever local capacity policy. This will help the agency focus and structure our thinking around local capacity. And it's open for public comment through January 31st next year. So we welcome your inputs there to really ensure that we as an agency, we as a donor are really prioritizing that local ownership and articulation of inclusion, agency empowered that we discussed here today. Building on everything that was said and really noting a lot of the themes that were coming out of last week's Summit for Democracy. And from my perspective, really in every session and in every component that you see of the new presidential initiative for democratic renewal, the US government and USAID are committed to supporting civil society as a foundational and equal partner necessary for democracy, not only to survive, but also to succeed and thrive. And yes, it is very precious in that regard. And so as we move forward, as we go into this post-summit crucial year of 2022, or the year of action, as we're calling it, we can be certain that the CSOSI country and regional reports from 2020 will serve us well, as they have for over 20 years. So just as a final note to close out, I want to say a huge thank you to FHI 360 for their valued work on CSOSI and on many other projects. And specifically, thank you to Michael, Eka, Alex, William, and Lisa, as well as Jennifer Stewart and the team at ICNL for bringing us together here for this event today. And just one last note, huge thank you to the team at USAID who worked tirelessly throughout the year to put the entire CSOSI reports together, folks in USAID missions, folks in our regional bureaus, and of course in our Center for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance. And specifically,